Hello, my name is André-Marie Tremblay from Sherbrooke, Institut quantique. Today I'm going to talk about the mechanism of superconductivity in cuprates, having in mind the optimization of the superconducting transition temperature. I'm going to discuss results from the three-band Hubbard model. This work was done with my colleague David Senechal, his student Sidhartha Dash, and my two students Nicolas Kowalski and Patrick Sémon. The method that will be used is cluster dynamical mean field theory, and the impurity solver will be exact diagonalization. We take as a basis in each unit cell a d orbital on the copper atom and p orbitals on the oxygen atoms. There are hopping parameters between all these orbitals, and we will focus on parameters epsilon p and epsilon d representing the occupation energy of orbital p and d. The interactions will be on the I will present results for the d-wave superconducting order parameter. I will compare theory with three experiments that attempt to correlate optimal TC with physical parameters. First, an experiment on nuclear magnetic resonance, then scanning tunneling microscopy, and finally, neutron scattering. Let us start with realistic modelizations of the parameters of the three-band Hubbard model. This table presents the results of electronic structure calculations for the microscopic parameters entering the three-band Hubbard model for various high-temperature superconductors, along with their optimal transition temperature. Let us take as our reference BISCO 2212. If you compare all the values here in this column, they are very similar, so we will take this as our unit of energy. Then if you look at the various columns rapidly, you see that the parameters don't vary that much, perhaps factors of 2, compared with the wide range of variations of the optimal transition temperature. Here you see the density of states for our reference material plotted as a function of energy. In blue is the density of states on copper, and in green on oxygen. Red is for the total density of states. You can see the lower Hubbard band, the upper Hubbard band, and the charge transfer gap. At the Fermi energy, there's a strong hybridization between copper and oxygen. This is the Zhang-Rice singlet band. So for this compound, we take TPP equals 1, as I mentioned, and epsilon p minus epsilon d is 2.3. We call this the covalent case. For our purpose, we consider another case that we will call the ionic case, where again TPP is 1, and this time epsilon p minus epsilon d is large. So you can clearly see the lower Hubbard band and the upper Hubbard band. In the background here, you see the famous phase diagram for high temperature cuprate superconductors. For a given hole concentration, the hole has a probability of being either on the copper, Nd, or on the oxygen, Np. You also see, as a function of temperature here, the superconducting domes for various families or materials that are superconducting. Clearly, the optimal Tc is not correlated with the hole content. On the other hand, if you look at the axis for oxygen hole content, you see that there seems to be a trend with increasing Tc and increasing oxygen hole content. Let us check whether calculations are consistent with this correlation. So for our covalent model here, we plot the d-wave superconducting order parameter as a function of oxygen hole content. These various domes here correspond to different materials, in other words, to different parameters. The parameters here are changed one at a time compared with this reference material. Clearly, the superconducting order parameter is generally larger for larger oxygen hole content, except here at the large oxygen hole content, but what happens in this region is that the charge transfer gap is closing. Let us continue with the comparison between calculation and this second experiment that correlates TC with the charge transfer gap. So here is the D-wave order parameter as a function of charge transfer gap. And as you can see from the calculation, maximum superconducting order parameter as a function of charge transfer gap gives this same inverse correlation as that was observed experimentally. So these two curves are for respectively the covalent class of models, and this one for the ionic class of models. So you see that a given charge transfer gap does not determine uniquely the value of the maximum superconducting order parameter. In fact, these two experiments tell us essentially the same thing, because optimal oxygen hole content and charge transfer gap are essentially perfectly correlated for both ionic and covalent models, for reasons I could explain in the question period. So finally, what is the Cooper pairing mechanism? Let us move to superexchange. The third comparison between theory and experiment that we want to make is between neutron scattering and the following calculations for superexchange, J here, as a function of charge transfer gap. As you can see, the calculated superexchange goes down with the charge transfer gap for both the covalent class of models and the ionic class of models. That's easy to understand if you look at the well-known expression for the superexchange and you replace U by the charge transfer gap. Now we understand the difference between the ionic and the covalent class of models. Indeed, it's clear that the effective hopping will be smaller for the ionic model than for the covalent model. Now, if you plot the maximum superconducting order parameter as a function of superexchange, you see that both the ionic and covalent class of models show very good correlations between the maximum superconducting order parameter and superexchange. And this is what neutron scattering reveals as well. If you look at the maximum TC as a function of superexchange, you see that there's a nice, very nice correlation. We have just understood the importance of covalency in high temperature superconductor, because for a given charge transfer gap, stronger covalent bonds will lead to larger superexchange. So we understand the importance of this old plot of the affinity of first row transition metal compared with the ionization energy of oxygen, and we see that copper and oxygen form the strongest covalent bond. So let me summarize. These are a few design principles then for a high temperature superconductor. Spin 1/2, one band, 2 dimensions, and strong covalency between the chalcogen and a transition metal. And we want a charge transfer gap that is just opening. In other words, we want intermediate interactions. We want a large J at half filling. Given nowadays the existence of high throughput DFT calculations, of artificial intelligence, data mining, and design principles, we may hope to be able to design a room temperature superconductor. So the take-home messages are that the detailed picture of the origin of superconductivity in cuprates follows from a model that takes into account copper, oxygen, kinetic energy, and repulsion, and we need to look beyond traditional tools of solid-state physics to work this out. Thank you.